and maybe we can go from there to make the transition, both discussing the film and then moving into, because one of my aims was to understand this idea of exhibition and how you create like world fairs and how you display people and in order to produce knowledge. Like one of the questions that science, of course, asks to itself is it ideological? Is it political? Is it economically motivated, etc.? And there is a really one way of, I mean, there is one way of really easy way of answering that question in science, to the extent that, oh, of course, scientists are also human beings. They're also motivated by greed and human passions, etc. But good scientists are more dispassionate to the extent that they can manage to be more objective, etc. These kinds of ideological questions might be avoided. So like in Hollywood movies, you always have like this one corrupt scientist who does certain bad things, and then there's an uncorruptible scientist who fixes it. Like this is the kind of main ideological problem. And then we realize today, for example, the same discourse plays itself out. Like scientists, they were scientists, but we wouldn't really call them scientists anymore because they were false scientists, believed that they were real racial differences based on biology. And now science says like, oh, those scientists were racist, but also they were wrong. And since they were wrong, they were racist. If they were right, they would not be racist. That's the kind of ideological defense of both science and scientific method, etc. Now, the question for us is, our interest is not accusing scientists to be racist or not. I'm sure they have to deal with their own issues, but to raise this ontological question, if science starts with the phenomenon as it is presented in front of them, then they are maybe asking a question that is already late. They are not asking this basic ontological question as to how what I experience is constructed in the first place. Because they look at nature, nature is constructed for them in a non-ideological, non-historical way. There are things, there are forces, there are neutral, objective facts, and I'm just merely studying them. And social science and even humanities reflects that model. It's like, oh, I look at these people. There are people who came from Africa. I study their characteristics, but I don't really discuss, understand, or even entertain how this social construction happened in the first place. They came to the United States or like to the Americas through a certain ways, etc. So when science asks a question, it has this in a completely ahistorical way. There is something in front of me, and I measure their skulls. Like what can go wrong? I'm just measuring their skulls. And from that, I'm making some conclusion. The question is, how is the object of science constructed in the first place? And that's an ontological question. That's not a simple question of bias. It's not like it is wrongly constructed or something like that. But if you ask a question that is already too late, this is sort of the problem of science. Like you are already asking a question that is too late. This is something that we discussed last time. Like, do you want this or do you not want this? That's already too late because you don't really know how those two alternatives emerged in the first place. And so today, scientists are operating in the exact same methodological framework. Sure, we are not basing human differences on race. Well, some of them are still doing it, I suppose, but like mostly accepted, we are not doing it on race. So we are doing it on DNA. I mean, DNA, what's wrong with DNA? It's empty, it's objective, it is true for everybody. It can even give you percentages. It can sort of percentagize or whatever it is, makes percentage from their category. But the model is the same because they don't really understand or even ask the question of how these differences emerged in the first place. Why? People were subjected to certain conditions for centuries. So when you are a 21st century American criminologist, whatever the hell that means, for example, there are criminologists. So I study crime. I study people who are criminals. I am an FBI, like you have those shows like the FBI profile. It's like you are treating as if human beings naturally are born as criminals. There are some kinds of psychopaths or psychopaths, etc. So these kinds of constructions of categories, but how the idea of what counts as crime, what doesn't emerge in the first place. What are the conditions under which people live, and subjected to these conditions don't even enter into the question. And that's really the main difference when we are asking with colonizing Egypt, the ontological constitution of the object of science. Object is not something that naturally occurs in nature. This is the basic ideological fundamental mistake we make, because we are prejudiced by the ontology of natural sciences. And we assume like nature exists as an object out there, independently of its both ontological, but also epistemological constitution. Object always appears in front of a subject. We always define ourselves and our relationship to the world in a certain way, such that those objects of inquiry or science emerge in the first place. This is our premise. This is what you need to understand. And you need to be convinced of that because, understand that this is what the argument is, because it goes against all the fundamental presuppositions that we make today with respect to science. And I always argue this in terms of like the climate change argument, in the sense that like science assumes that there is a climate. Science assumes that there is a measurement, something to be measured. Science assumes that there is an objective reality, and ultimately, of course, independently of these conditions emerge. How did they emerge? Most of it is science's contribution. Why are we so, what is our relationship to the planet? It's always already, at least for the last 500 years, defined in terms of a scientific relationship. It became an object of science, something to be exploited, something to be tortured to get answers, which is like the description of certain scientists. Then, of course, the emerging fact is not something that naturally occurs. It's a fact that we constructed in our relationship to nature. Now, we cannot ask this question independently as if this is an objective fact. Now, when we talk about like, did we contribute to global warming or did we not? That's already a late question, like how we established our relationship to the world, to nature, such that it emerged as the object of science in the first place. Because object of science does not just occur in nature. This is a fundamental ontological mistake. Science doesn't study trees and buildings and flowers and birds. They study scientific objects, things that can be measured, things that can be related to each other, things that can be controlled, etc. That's an important point to understand if we are going to understand how colonies became an object of knowledge. And make something into an object of knowledge is already a power relationship that has a history, a structure, and something that we need to understand. That's why, my issue with like the other sciences, social sciences, is like not raising this question in terms of like, you are asking a question like, how do nations relate to each other? Like, you cannot ask this question as if this question emerged like now in the 21st century, but independently of the history of nationalism, how those nations are always already constructed in relation to each other, not independently of each other. So like, I studied comparative politics in college, for example. One of the courses that really blew my mind, like, what are you comparing to? What are you comparing to? Those that you are assuming separate identities that you are, relating to, it's sort of like comparative studies of master and slave type of thing. It's like they already emerge in relation to each other. They already ontologically constituted historically, but also conceptually. And that sort of already, I mean, any answer that you can give in that domain is always going to be suspect to this ontological analysis, namely, how did the United States emerge? And I think that answers that question in that movie very well, in terms of not just people came and worked a little bit and kind of like hung out here, etc., but there are multiple relations with different people and to themselves, really, like how national identity emerges as white, which is, it happens, it's not a natural thing. It happens through a certain self-relation. Okay, I got a little excited about that. Yes, Claudia, go ahead.
I think it's interesting that you started like talking about like the natural aspect and the science, because that was like one of my biggest not issues but like questions mostly that bothered me through the whole like film, and how like they talked about like making something natural, how they used science to like naturalize race and like other things apart from like that. And then my question is, how can something be made into like natural, or like make it seem natural apart from like obviously like constructing it through science and like even having like political backup, but just like the idea that something that is actually maybe not even natural, how can they like make it seem as natural and like believe it, apart from like those power systems that actually reassure that that's natural just because of biases. But just like the idea of making, for example, like making blacks for example less intelligent, something natural that comes from that, like that was something that came to mind when like seeing the documentary, and that was like, that's so stupid, that's not like, I don't know.
Well, it is, of course, stupid, but the more insidious question is like, how do we continue to make these assumptions in different ways now? Because when you sort of measure certain things, you already measure things that are already constructed. And if you take them as an indication of something objective and natural, then you are actually solidifying that which you are culturally created. And I think the discursively, the construction of the natural is an ideological performance, namely something that exists today in front of us. We believe it's natural. That's the sort of problematic nature of a naive scientific approach. Then you can come up with statistical ideas because you behaved in a certain way in colonies for centuries. Now, of course, if you measure their, I don't know, GRE scores, of course, people in Egypt are not going to score as high in SAT or GRE, and that's an objective fact. But that's an objective fact that is created on the base of an ideological relationship and historical relationship. So if as a scientist, you have this kind of confidence and say, oh, I can objectively state people in certain parts of the world score more in GRE than other parts, then you are not really discovering anything natural. You are simply, by naturalizing something, quote unquote, justifying an ideological position. So that's the idea with respect to any kind of differences with respect to race. It's not like races developed independently from each other and somehow came into a comparative politics class. They are developed in relation to each other, and their whatever identity that you are attributing to the other is already the identity that you created in relation to yourself. So yes, like making something natural is a fundamentally conservative and reactionary position. And Derrida says that, I mean, you can also like tie this in, and you should, to this deconstructive gesture, that natural is always that which is privileged as opposed to cultural. Why? Because we think natural things are more permanent, they are like more objective, they are more sort of, people should accept them. And cultural, like, oh, we can just like change them because it's purely cultural, etc. Not that it is not true, of course, it might be easier to change natural things than cultural things, but moreover, they are always constructed in relation to each other. And you always naturalize your own culture, and you think like, oh, mine is not culture, that's the natural thing. And every culture has that to a certain degree, in terms of like, you know, when you have these interaction with different cultures, and you say like, what are they doing? That's so unnatural. Like, who does that? That's so ridiculous. Like, for other cultures, and you know, this is not necessarily a power thing, but in science, it's important. So I do want to put on the table this question as to why, how science conceptually contributes to the construction of colonialism. Not just accidentally, not because scientists are bad people at the time or something like that, but scientific discourse itself, in terms of this idea of production of knowledge and control and power, is inescapably that. So yes, of course, when you make these generalizations about any group, African Americans, Africans, or whatever, you're always going to encounter that question. Like, it doesn't matter whether what you say is in a sort of statistical, trivial sense true or not. What is important is how that truth itself is constructed. And colonies buy this too. I mean, that's the other thing, like, that drives something in Turkey drives me. It's like, but Europe is superior to us, so they must be better. I mean, I encountered this argument a lot in certain parts of the third world. And it's like, oh, well, yeah, Europe kicked our ass, so they must be naturally better. They are smarter, they are more curious. They are just like Germans. They are very like structured thinkers, and all these kinds of like ridiculous generalizations of trying to justify a power structure that is created. Because you don't ask that sort of ontological question, like, whatever it is in front of you, how is this constructed? How is it constituted? It doesn't just happen. Okay, so this is the framework. We are going to start talking more about the film after the break. So let's just take a longish break, like 1:30, so that we can go another larger session. The connection between the film and the text we are reading, in terms of this idea of exhibition, how it frames the question of truth, and what integration means in terms of power relationship. And yeah, any other thoughts, ideas?
One of the things that, like, it was not so much a striking part of the film itself, but one thing that was talking about how we started to see it shift between like looking to it strictly white and athletes, and how that linguistic shift in a formal context really redefines the body. I mean, I was thinking kind of back to like the earlier talk that you talked about, like, in the book you call it, say, for talking about how it is we observe qualities and we describe it as how that changes, typically within the legal context.
Well, how we define national identity too, how that turned out in terms of whiteness too. Now, of course, there is a certain conceptual difficulty in every sort of category, of course, and in that context, like, whiteness itself is constructed in a certain way. Who counts as white, who doesn't, one, and also in what context you are white, in one context you aren't. And people who come to the United States, for example, have this crisis in terms of understanding themselves in relation to that constructed notion of whiteness and how that plays itself out. Again, we have these sort of passionate arguments, etc., but always recognizing that it is first historical, it's not permanent, it never stays stable, it's always an unstable category. And I guess the malleability of power is also very important. So the establishment of power and the preservation of that power structure really depends on its ability to change under certain circumstances. And white is also that, like, in order to continue with a power structure, the definition of the white has to be permeable. It has to change according to certain circumstances. Yes. But it will always exclude something.
I was watching it and like the talking about it and how yeah like how it's being created, like they are obviously aware of it, but at the same time like the depiction of how like how they were telling this story and saying it is still they sort of stay back on similar. You're aware, but at the same time, you're still you make sure.
Well, you mean the first episode?
Yeah.
Well, okay, there are two things here. The first one, how is it? I mean, that's really the definition of ideology. Like, you are aware of the facts that you are not aware of. That's really the kind of good definition of why we continue to do certain things, even though at some level we know them to be problematic. And I think that's really ideology, like, you know, we sort of Earlham College ideology. Like, we know we are not perfect. We are trying to be better. We are not good. There is oppression in society, but we'll continue. We'll continue the way in which we exist. I mean, this is kind of like a fairly typical white liberal ideology. It's like, yeah, things are not great, but we are trying. Come on, etc. But in the first one that you might watch in the future of the race, the power of an illusion, there is this scene that they bring a lot of students to a lab who students who look different. One is African American, one is Asian American, one is from another country, I don't know which one, etc. And then they do their DNA test. And they discover actually that they are very similar in terms of their DNA to people who look very different than them. And that somehow exposes for them the irony, I guess, of classifying people on the basis of external appearance, because underlying this external appearance, there is a commonality that you cannot even guess. Like, you would think that I would look different than some person in terms of racial and ethnic categories look different than me, but in fact, it turns out that my DNA is 99% like the same, although like we are 97% with rats too, I suppose. Like, that's the kind of nature of DNA. So, and then we still try to classify human beings in terms of now DNA. And it's very possible that on some basis you are sort of gonna say like, oh, your DNA is great because it has 82% this and 72% this, etc. So we still operate with the same, like, science is like, you are correcting yourself, but you are still within the same framework of categorization. Like, now, to me, is like the maybe 50 years from now, people are going to say like, oh, I can't believe there was Ancestry. How could my grandparents live with Ancestry.com around? Like, how could they like they could advertise on television. Oh my God, like, how is that even possible? People are going to say that because it's sort of like the same kind of like, you are 72% white, you are 18% this, etc. That's going to be a different power relations created around it, and oppression, of course, and people are not going to be people are going to be aware of that. So yeah, that's an issue, that's a problem, and again, that's why we need a conceptual, consistent, and coherent critique of methodology. And I think with this book, we are trying to step into that. And the first issue of the question of representation, how representing something in terms of representation, you need to think in two ways at least, in terms of feeling like the category stands in for something. So when you are saying like you are Black, you get the impression that that representation stands for something. It represents a reality. That's the first presupposition of representation that is going to be put into question. It creates its own reality effect, in the sense that once you start representing it, you start believing that there is something ontologically behind it that is real. That is very important to question. And I'm not simply saying like, oh, there is no reality behind it. What I'm saying is that that reality is always created in relation to that representation. Now, with respect to objects of social science and human sciences, etc., it is easier to understand how those objects are constructed, how they are historical, how they are cultural, how they are permeable, how they are always questionable. Now, with science, we believe, with hard sciences, with natural sciences, we tend to believe that their objects are more permanent. We believe that they are more consistent, more coherent, and more ahistorical. Outside of history, they have their own natural existence. And therefore, every time you want to make a social scientific claim, you try to make the object more permanent. Now, race is a category like that because it is a social category in terms of how we organize each other, in terms of our relationship. But once we start to make it natural, biological, we are giving it more weight, more permanence, more legitimacy. Like, oh, it is a natural thing. Hence, you cannot just like willy-nilly question it because you need to respect the power of the natural. And that is, again, what I try to show, what he tries to show here is an ideological move. Namely, things that you want to be more permanent, established, conserved, you tend to cast them as natural and make the object of natural science. And that's the sort of ontological aspect of natural sciences. Their objects are also constructed. Now, for those of you who study philosophy of science, of course, this appears to be more obvious to you in your studies because you read texts to that effect. But the issue here in the 17th, 18th century European discourse, especially with Descartes, but also this kind of scientific understanding of the world appears that which can present itself, represent itself into an isolated atomic subject who knows, who can think, who can doubt. Now you say, oh, isn't that natural? Isn't that obvious? Isn't that the case? But historically, that way of thinking emerges at a specific juncture, not has always been with us. And that's another thing that we do. When we tend to believe that something is ideologically strong, powerful, then we read that into the entire history. We kind of think, oh, like if you are a really like hardcore capitalist, people have always been greedy. What does that mean? Like people have always been greedy in the same way? they did the same things because they are greedy? Did they behave in the same way because they are greedy? No. What you are trying to do is to naturalize, historicize a kind of ideological conviction that you have at the present and read that back into the history. Like what I'm doing here is not so different or problematic or questionable because they've always been doing this. And you should always be careful with respect to that. Like whenever sort of, even within science, that discourse doesn't exist because, sciences do this really strange thing is like, science is what is now. Like everything that happened in the past, like scientists obsessed about race and turned out to be racist, etc., they were just wrong. They are gone, they are finished. They are not part of me. It's not part of my discourse. They used science wrongly, hence they were not even proper scientists. And that's the kind of another ideological discourse in terms of justifying what is now, and whatever is in the past, oh, well, that's just wrong. Not seeing that as the constitutive of today. The reason that we think that race is not a scientific category is because we really screwed up for the last 2-3 centuries. It's not independent of the consequences of it, because I can't even imagine how that would be possible, but you can imagine, oh, we used this category and race and it worked beautifully. Everything like brought world peace, everybody understood each other very well, appreciated their differences, and we really like took to it and endorsed the concept. It's almost like DNA, which we now all love because it's objective and great and wonderful. You can't object to it and you cannot question it. And that's the analysis of the discourse. So it starts with this. Yeah, go ahead.
So with DNA is supposed to kind of file a person into
Well, that's what they tell me on Ancestry.com. But I mean, of course, that's not a very serious analysis of DNA, I suppose.
Yeah. But if we need to understand the history of an idea or whatever, of science, the history of a pattern of thought, so I'm thinking like, in order to understand your own personal history, you need to know the circumstances from which you came, how the ideas that you build up based on just like growing up or whatever. How is that? Because that kind of uses DNA in the sense that you come from a certain place. There's like this certain biological. You're from Wales, I don't know, whatever, and you use that to kind of understand, okay, so I have this historical context based in this place. But that's, I don't know, you kind of use DNA to do that. So is that process, I guess colonizing is the right word, but is that process,
let's say, questionable?
Yeah.
Again, as the constitution of what kind of a being you are, it doesn't have to be, but when you are associating yourself with Wales, I guess you are also at the same time distinguishing yourself from being from Scotland. So what kind of decision are we going to make on the basis of that? Like, why does that define you as opposed to me, right? That's what I'm questioning in terms of how we understand ourselves. Like as a social experiment, you can imagine like, what difference would it make if you tell 1 million people something entirely different about their DNA? What difference would that make culturally? like, because like in the commercials, like, oh, I'm 46% Scottish, I should wear a kilt and start drinking single malt, or like these kinds of cultural stereotypes that we use to already established categories. Like, because being from Wales comes with over-determination. Now you can discover whether I have a certain kind of disease, and you can try to cure me to the extent that I am a sort of purely medical being. Sure, I mean, I'm not like, you know, if that works, I guess. But in terms of my relationship to myself, like, how does that define me now that I discovered I'm 46% Scottish? Like, what difference does that make for me? What difference would that make in terms of my relationship to you if you also discovered that you are 46% Scottish? And I was like, oh, Esther, I really hated you. But now that we discovered, like, we are 46% same, I love you, everything is great. That's the sort of problem of relating to yourself in terms of this category. So I'm not like questioning the scientific validity of it being even perhaps accurate. Like, you know, you discovered certain DNA gets stuck in your sort of background, in your teeth from where you lived or something like that. Things like that happen. But what is that going to prove to me in terms of myself?
I think I was thinking cool.
Yes, Masha.
What was the question that
The
Esther
question
asked?
is, like, if we do this DNA test and if we discover that we are this and that, like, how does that affect our identity? Doesn't it affect our identity? Doesn't it have any? And perhaps that's maybe the problem. Like, why do we want to establish solidarity among people on the basis of where they come from? Doesn't that separate you and me inescapably, like permanently? Because, like, not only we do not relate to each other now, but our ancestors has never related. We, you know, like, it creates even more of a kind of chasm among human beings. So again, you want to be close to people in Wales, perhaps, but that very gesture separates you from people who are constantly fighting with the Wales.
Yeah, I think I was thinking of DNA as more of a tool to deconstruct our identity. Like, okay, I have these preconceptions of things that I was taught by my parents. And understanding, like, where you kind of come from, you can understand the context of, oh, that's why I believe a certain thing. Oh, that's why there's this tradition in this family that might have been inherently problematic.
Okay, well, the question is whether DNA can be understood as a deconstruction of identity rather than construction of it. And maybe if you just say my DNA is, I don't even know how to refer to it. Like, is there like a sequence? Biology majors? Yes, Hannah, how does it work?
Oh, I don't know. I was just gonna make a comment. Didn't we at one point decide and discuss that like putting too much value in our national identity is one of the ways identity would a constructive way of thinking about ourselves as opposed to a deconstructive way?
Well, okay. It doesn't mean like just because, I mean, that's why I was saying that ancestry is problematic, because there is a DNA sequence, but to name it in terms of national categories is another cultural step. Like, you know, your DNA doesn't show itself in the form of an Italian flag as opposed to British flag or something like that. It just has this kind of whatever biological expression of that there is. Now, sure, but DNA doesn't give us nationality. It just gives our biological affinity with people who lived somewhere for an extended period of time. Because that's really biologically what it means to be from another country, right? Like your ancestors and people who had your DNA lived there for a long time and sort of, if I understand that correctly, they took on the environmental characteristics of living there. Like, you know, there's a lot of dust in the air, or it gets into your teeth, and then it's carried to your children, and then they start having asthma, and then you have this, and then that's carried to your genes, and they become this. Like that kind of environmental effects of biological effects of environment. That's really like the best definition of nationalism, to the extent that Ancestry uses that. But this is not a biology class. So yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, in terms of ancestry, it might as well be like it contains some sort of like sentiment related to nationalism, because people place so much power in like their ancestral past. And I'm just wondering, like, I don't know, in terms of like the comment I made about national identity, it's not like your nationality per se, but people take so much pride in it that for some people it might as well be, if that makes any sense. So like it's still like part of the problem. Do what?
Might as well be what?
Like like the same sentiment that we attach to national identity. Like, well, I'm from the United States, I'm American, but my ancestors come from this place in Europe. And then you start to identify parts of yourself. You start to adopt like that mindset, whether you mean to or not.
That would be interesting. Like, and that's the sort of aspect of self-consciousness. Once you are aware of it, until you become aware of it. Like once you become aware, you're right. You might start acting like German, whatever the hell that means, or like French, or I'm going to speak with an accent now because I'm, you know, like that sort of self-constitution in terms of this supposed objective knowledge. It's not an objective knowledge. It's always a mediated knowledge, because part of being German is thinking of what it means to be German. It's not like a greenness of the book. The book doesn't think like, how should I be green? But being like German or American or anything is always that self-consciousness of mediating that through yourself.
Yeah, I think the reason I brought that up was because back in the 8th grade, that was when my dad had the whole like, you're an 8th German conversation with me. And we did a Holocaust unit in my social studies class. And my 8th grade self was like proud of like my ancestry. And I was like, it was definitely the wrong context to be like, I have a German ancestral line. Yeah. But there was this one guy who kept calling me a Nazi for like the entire unit. So I was kind of thinking about that. Like, even though it was an 1/8 of my ancestral line, like I was German to this guy, like entirely German during that unit. I don't know.
Well, you should you should have investigated that guy. Maybe he was German too and trying to get out of that thing. So, yeah, I mean, that's exactly true. It's also interactional. I mean, what it means to be German is not something that only is defined by biology or by Germans. It's always defined by others, or in relation to others, and in mediation to others. So that's important to notice. Yeah. There is no human category that is independent of interaction with the other. Nobody is what they are by themselves, ever. Okay, so this book starts with the idea of representation. And I think that's a very both literal representation, representing them, making them present. And this is the sort of background of the anthropological sciences, like literally bringing people as the objects of study. And you go to the tribes or some kind of like, I don't know whether it's still the case, but ethnographically, they always have this kind of, these are my people. These are the people I represent. I go, I love them. They are like, I also take on their own characteristics. I become like, this is a little bit more objective. This is more kind of trying to create an exhibition and the world as an exhibition. And I think that's a really important ontological idea to notice, namely, we observe the world. The world is now something to be seen, something to present itself to a subject who talks about the 3 characteristics of that, is put into the position of the center. To put the subject into the center of the exhibition and also formulating knowledge out of that is what he thinks that the Western European scientific knowledge is. Therefore, when I was talking about the construction of identity in terms of your own self-constitution and being the owner of your identity is the continuation or even the sort of logical continuation of this way of understanding ourselves in the world. We observe the world, the world is organized around us, and it presents to us as knowledge. Now that gives me power. That gives me the power of position. Now, this position is not like superior position in terms of hierarchy, etc., but a neutral position, the position of the observer. Everything is organized around that observer. And that's important because that's the knowledge that is produced within scientific discourse. Namely, you can put any person into that position. It's not going to make a difference. And this is really something scientists take pride in. Namely, this experiment is not just for me. What do they say? It is reproducible. Any person can occupy that position. It doesn't matter who you are. That position is created, and that is another way of saying that experiment can be reproduced anywhere. It's always going to lead to the same result because that position is neutral. That position is the position of pure power. Anybody can occupy that. So at first sight, the distinction between representation and external reality seemed very clearly determined. And what happens in that creation of that position is the distinction between external reality and representation collapses. There is no such clear distinction of what is representation and what is external reality. Now, this is important to notice in concepts like race, because race could be a pure representation. First, we assume that when we use the concept of race, there is a opposition between race, what I talk about, a kind of discourse, etc., and an actual reality, namely whatever race stands for. But then you realize it is the representation and the repetition of that representation and the consistency of the discourse concerning representation is reality, in fact, creates a reality effect. It behaves like reality. Therefore, when today science says like race is not a real concept, it doesn't matter, because race is a real concept, not in the way that you meant it at first as an independent reality, but it's a reality as the function of representation. Function of representation, the consistency of representation. And you can call this in terms of like self-fulfilling prophecy, you can call it in terms of creation of the object discursively, but it doesn't make it any less real. In fact, today, I would argue most of what you consider to be real is constructed discursively. Now, a lot of people today want to make this distinction as bright as possible. There are discursive objects and there are real objects. And you don't talk to me about discursive objects, you make them up. There are objective objects. That is a problematic distinction precisely because objective object is what you want to make consistent as a discursive production. I want that to be continued to be reproduced. Now, we observe that today, obviously, most strikingly in the construction of what we consider scientific objects. You should ask that question to yourself seriously. What does science consider its object today? What is the object of physics? Not your chair, not your, like walls, etc. I mean, they can give you examples from that, but that's not their object. What's the object of biology? What do they study? What is biology of physics? Like, atoms and whatever the multiple divisions of indivisible atoms. Like, what is the object now? And is it a sort of theoretical construct, actually, rather than a physical object? And that's what you need to ask in terms of that permeable distinction between the purely theoretical discursive as opposed to real. That distinction is not always clear. So There are three features of the world exhibition I will mention. This is on page 7 in the text that I'm reading. I want to get at least there and then we'll go back to it. I will, in order to illustrate how this distinction was set up, the apparent realism of the exhibit, their organization around the common center, apparent realism, common center, and the position of the visitor as the occupant of the central point. So apparent realism, representation, first you need to make a really good representation, very accurate, like, you know, if you are, do we have those things now in at Erlum International Days? We used to do those after pandemic, we don't do that anymore. So do you have like International Day festival, blah, blah? Before pandemic, now it's like the positive impact of pandemic, no more International Day. So what did they do? Did you represent your? You didn't go?
So I helped someone make stand if someone else was that. But like there's like all these stands so that like people from different places.
This is my country.
The facts about
Food, of course, yeah. So then you should ask yourself this question, like there are these international festivals and days, like you are supposed to represent. Like every time you come, I mean, if you are a foreigner in the United States, for example, you are always asked this question, like how would you represent your country? Like what's with your country? Like how would you represent it? And you need to make an exhibition, maybe not in physical things, but in words, but you kind of make it consumable for someone who is going to see that. Like here is a board that I made with respect to my country. Here is like some objects that represent my country. Like, and you roughly know like what you would do from another country. Like what would you do like if you go abroad, if you're an American citizen and tell you like, represent America, I mean, United States. What would you put? What would be like good objects to put to represent America? Reveal your prejudice.
McDonald's.
Yes, of course, the big M. Yeah. How much does McDonald's really represent the United States?
A gun.
What?
A gun.
A gun. A gun. Oh, a gun. Just one. That would represent any country. If you want the United States, you should put like a lot. So, what else? I mean, you understand the absurdity of the situation. And then if you were to put into this position, so how would you represent the United States? You don't think about like, I wouldn't. That would be the problem. That would be the ontological problem of doing it. Yes.
Through American things, either there has to be performance where America shows up last and steals one thing from every other table.
I think Greeks would do the same thing.
Exactly.
The ancient Greeks. Yeah. Did you hear it? The true thing would be the United States would show up last and take one thing from every single table and put it together. That's Kate's representation of the United States, not very flattering. Anyway, the point is though, is to create this position from which that you can, in the first instance, objectify something. And that's really an important element in terms of our relationship to the objects of science. We always think that we are outside of it. We are looking at it. It's an object outside of us. Now, with respect to nature, that again appears to be more acceptable because we put ourselves outside of nature and study it. But we don't really think the way in which we are implicated in that nature. Our very activity, not just our body, but our very activity is implied in that nature. Is it a natural activity to engage in science with respect to what we consider nature? And it is similar with respect to our understanding of human sciences and the social sciences. Is it like you raise a question like, what is a society? You raise that question in one class. You wouldn't, but imagine you were. Then that question would be part of that society. It is not purely external to that object that you are asking, but part of society is asking what society is. So in every scientific activity, we are caught in this ambiguous position of asking something about the other, what I consider to be an object, but also I am implicated. I am within that object that I'm asking. So whenever, that's why I sort of have this issue with psychology, among other things, is like, does psychologists have psyche? Is it part of their, like, does their discourse change human psyche? Or is it just like studying it purely as an object? Isn't it the case that human beings actually change their psyche by learning from psychology, hence implicating themselves within that discourse? Or are we just going to try create an objective discourse about object? So you understand this kind of complicated relationship to being implicated in what you study, right? Right over there. I need some shaking hands. Yes. Absolutely, everything. Yeah. Philosophy actually like constantly says that. That's why you get into trouble in philosophy, because that part of, like, I keep saying it's like, but it's sort of like too circular that. Then people are like, oh, this sounds too abstract or something, too self-rational, too like, it's like philosophy is always should be what philosophy is. That's the question. That's the kind of self-referentiality, because you are not external to the question that you are raising. And that's what happens in scientific discourse. Now you are external. Now you are in an exhibition. Exhibition is different from you. The only person who can recognize that implication is the person who is in the exhibition exhibited. Therefore, he talks about the Egyptian delegation, not about those who created it. Because you, if you are in a power position, you do not see yourself implicated in that, what is exhibited. And that's kind of like medical discourse too. Like, doctors talk as if they never get a heart disease. Psychologists talk as if they never have psychological problems. And that's a power discourse. Like, I want to tell to my doctor, like, you are gonna die too. And it's not just me. So like, don't talk like you are the subject and I'm the object. And that's the kind of, I mean, of course, that's a personal thing, but like that kind of discursive element, like what I'm saying is independent of the object. So first, it was remarkable how perfectly the exhibition seemed to model an external world. Now, of course, the transition that he wants to make is that first they model an external world, but actually they create the external world. As the Egyptian visitor, of course, the Egyptian visitor is going to be noticing that, not the person who is putting together the exhibition. On the buildings representing Cairo, a street, even the paint was made dirty. That's the kind of like, that's a realistic representation. It was precisely the kind of accuracy of detail that created the certainty, the effect or a determined correspondence between model and reality. This is the obsession of scientific discourse. What we create as a model is a perfect representation of a reality. And then you notice maybe your model is creating the effect of reality. Very often, some of the most realistic exhibits were models of the city in which the exhibition was held and of the world of which it claimed to be the center. Like, I've never been to Las Vegas. Has anyone been to Las Vegas? That there are these kind of like models. Like, did you see them? Like, are they like accurate? Yeah, we don't do this like world exhibitions anymore, like world fairs, like in the turn of the century. There were a lot in Paris and St. Louis, and I think there was one in New York and etc. So they would, they talk about that in the film.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that like, if I connect, like, I think Mitchell also talks about how like the age of the exhibition also like, and then in the documentary, when when they did that first fair in St. Louis, it was like the point that like as an empire and sort of that connection to like being able like and so like I think you mentioned like there was a fear like also like the rise of like industrialism
Sure.
Britain
Yeah.
as well. And you get that see that it's a similar dynamic that like it sort of you get to a point where there's like a relationship where like one has the capacity to bring in everything else in the world to like exhibit and sort of like assert their own position as like this dominating force. And so like so I'm guessing like with Paris, with the fairs in Paris, for example, it's like the French are doing all these things like all over and they're like we sort of we got it now almost to bring Egypt here, we can bring everything much closer to us and like, see it, but we're still neutral, even if like we're doing that thing. So it's just like they're the like colonialism, like in the material sense, but there's still this like conceptual
Sure.
shift that happens when you get forward. And maybe why we don't get as many anymore is that like I guess like the US anyway as an empire is like it's still an empire but it's like declining slowly. And so maybe in like times of imperial decline, you get maybe less world exhibits almost because you can't I guess like maybe the power to exhibit is not strong.
Well, we can certainly raise that question why we don't have those exhibitions anymore in the same way. But yeah, we have a lot actually.
There's like this
I mean, not only do they exist, but that was a process of making the world into an exhibition. Now it is already an exhibition. Do we really need to do that anymore as much? Like, you relate to yourself as an exhibit in terms of how you present yourself to the external world. So that might be a complicated question that I don't know whether we can get into, but it was certainly in terms of material things too, like an economic sort of what do you call these world fairs, like the um, expos, right? Expo. Yeah, Hannah. Sorry.
I'm just
call you Hannah. Really.
okay. I'm just thinking about this problem in terms of like the educational system, and I feel like we've kind of modeled like social studies classes kind of based off of like this world exhibition thing. Like we had world fairs in high school, and like each family was assigned like a country or a culture, and we would make food and like posters and like present it like in a gym or something. Just Americans were making to put on display. And so I think in a way, like we've still kind of continued this attitude of like we're showing off that, hey, look at us, like we're educating ourselves. And like, but I don't really know. I don't know where I'm going with this, but it's still present in a way, I think.
Well, it's not only still present, you're absolutely right, but it is the model in terms of which we really understand education too. This is where you are educated according to an exhibition model of education. Like, for example, if I were to ask you, like, what would be your ideal class? And you would start describing it, and pretty soon it will turn into an exhibit. Like, I want a little bit of this, a little bit of that, give me some of this, give me some of that, a sampling of that, give me a survey. That survey is really an exhibition. Like, Give me as much as possible. Give me domination. Give me power. Empower me, because when I don't know something, then I feel like that has power over me. I want to have as broad of a perspective as possible so that I can be controlling as much as possible. And I think that's part of the kind of difficulty of sort of understanding liberal arts education sort of politically, in terms of give me as much power as possible, give me as much of a view as possible. I know I'm going to forget the details and I can become an expert later on, etc. But give me this broad view. And that's how we do, like, your history classes. Ancient Greek, then medieval, then modern, then postmodern, move on. Art history starts with like art history, like complete historical survey. Like give me everything, whether I understand it or not. So yes, that model of this empowerment in terms of perspective, in terms of occupying the position of the center. Maybe another form of education, which is not a high school education, but an education in different ways, in which decentering yourself, not being at the center, understanding yourself not at the center, not as empowering. Maybe you recognize yourself more disempowered. Maybe that's education. Maybe education is unlearning a bunch of things that you are assuming about yourself and the world, and finding different ways of thinking about that, not controlling it, but recognizing multiple ways in which you don't control. That would be a proper philosophical education. So these are the panoramas, like pictures. Give me an overall perspective. Like step back. This is what you are doing constantly. Like, step back and try to see the whole thing. Otherwise, I'm confused. I'm like thinking about certain things. I don't see the whole picture. Give me the whole picture. I want to rule that domain. Yes.
So if we have this sort of situation where the world is like made into Disneyland, he talks a bit about the Europeans abroad being very concerned with being perceived, or not wanting to be perceived when they're doing that work. Like, if you go to Disneyland, you don't care what Mickey Mouse is going to think of you. Or you go to Epcot and you don't care about, the Lebanese kid they hired to work the food cart in the Moroccan section of Epcot, because like in that situation, they're not a real person.
Uh-huh.
So in that sort of like, in a world that's made in exhibition, why is there that concern of being perceived?
Well, because being perceived,
Well, I mean, that's
accuracy. Do you mean the accuracy? Concern about being accurate, like it's a real picture.
No, it seems
Okay.
like this looks like I'm reading it, but Europeans are going abroad when they're doing their daguerreotyping and photography and punch, and they want themselves to be absent. They don't want to be perceived by the people in that environment.
Oh, okay.
They're putting on, the hats and sunglasses to hide. And so if you're in a situation where those people that you're interacting with aren't real people, then why would you be concerned about being perceived?
Well, you certainly think that they are real. So it is not like when you say Disney, you are sort of emphasizing entertainment aspect of it, maybe. But they are really concerned about the accuracy. Like those representations need to be accurate of what Egypt is like. Now, the problem is, you're absolutely right, that the position of the center is almost always invisible, and from which you see everything else. And that's the model of power. That power is the modern power. Modern power is invisible. The position, the locus of modern power is its invisibility. That is a position that you take on as a subject, but that, by definition, you are not seen within that exhibition. In the same, think about the same model that we are asking. A psychologist is not seen in the psyche. I am an invisible external observer. That gives me power. Because if I'm seen within it, then it makes me vulnerable. Because power is exercised on those who are seen, visible, by those who are not visible. Now, of course, this is not like some conspiracy. There are certain people visible, etc. But the position of power is invisibility because it appears neutral. It's like it doesn't exist. It's like accepted. And therefore, whenever we talk about the white supremacy, for example, it is not necessarily something that always visible. It's actually its invisibility. It's just you take for granted. It's just like the way things are, because everything else is constructed from that neutral or allegedly neutral position. So you don't want to be seen. This is not the power of the king who displays his power. This is the power of the panopticon, the power of that which is not seen and therefore has power. Right? So when you are visible, you are, so that's really the paradox of this. We as contemporary human beings, we sort of want to empower ourselves by making ourselves visible. I want to express myself. I want to, be as visible and visible as possible. That actually subjects you to power, doesn't empower you in the first instance. And that's really the point that he is trying to learn from Foucault and try to apply to this context. In the colonial context, colonizer is not necessarily the one who is seen. Colonizer is a neutral position. It's accepted as normal. It's not even seen as a power anymore. The most effective structural power is the one that is not even seen as power. Therefore, in a sort of Disney model, you don't even see the one who is doing the entertainment, right? So that person is there, and anybody can, but everything else is organized for that neutral and empty position. And all those are subject to power. And that's like, Foucault does this in terms of psychology and psychiatry and other human disciplines. You are sort of under the assumption that you are talking. You are thinking by talking and expressing yourself, etc., you are empowering yourself. In fact, you are making yourself subject to power. Therefore, colonized are not just like silenced, excluded, etc. They are ordered, they are organized in a certain way. They are always made visible. They are as if they are in prison. When you are in prison, you are always seen, right? You must always be followed. All your actions have to be observed, monitored. The one who does the monitoring, who actually has the power, is never seen. That's where the power lies, in the invisibility. Yes. Erased? Well, I mean, yeah, exterminated, type of like killed. Sure, I mean, but that's not power. Well, yes and no, to the extent that their histories are, but I mean, this is a negative aspect of colonization. You are absolutely right, like eradication, but also no, like in order to be able to even control and even eradicate them, you make them object of knowledge.
But how do you, I don't know, how do you fight against the
Well, that's exactly the question we are going to ask. You certainly don't empower yourself by making yourself visible. That's the paradox. Well, you try to undermine the very structure that solicits you to be visible. Why do I need to be visible in order to be able to live? Why do I need to defend my existence? Like as an individual, to the sub-power, to like sort of say, oh, I deserve to live too, because I'm solicited to make that claim. So like, think about what's happening today. Like we are all of us are following the regulations, the orders of this whole pandemic structure. And we do it voluntarily, and we do it in order to protect ourselves. That's pure modern political power, for better or for worse. I'm not saying don't do it, etc. But what is happening is your voluntary investment in the creation of certain structure in the society. You go to get the shot, you get the card, you subject yourself to power. Now you can be counted. You are constantly visible. You survey. Do you do that? You should do that. Maybe you do it. Like every morning you get a thing from Earlham as an employee, like, are you having COVID symptoms? You say no and submit it. You are always allowing yourself to be produced knowledge about you. And that's pure political power of today. Now, again, you will say, get mad and say, what, you want to die of COVID? It's like, no, of course, power never really just works in order to exterminate you, which it did in the history, of course. But it is also insidious, like if you are going to exist in this world, this is how you need to exist. That's this is what power is today. Defines the way in which we can exist. And that's in the colonies as well as how we are made into colonies. So in order to survive, you need to play by the rules of the colonizer. So, okay, let me just read this. Spectacles like the World Exhibition. This is on page 6. I went back to page 6. Spectacles like the World Exhibition and the Orientalist Congress set up the world as a picture. This world is a picture, and you are part of that picture. You need to be visible as a part of that picture. They know you within that picture. You are the object of knowledge. They ordered it up before an audience as an object of display to be viewed, experienced, and investigated. The Great Exhibition of 1851, pretty early, in London claimed to present to it 6 million visitors, a living picture of the development of mankind. That's also important of 19th century idea of social Darwinism and evolution and how they perceive themselves as a species. Orientalism, it was claimed in the same way at the inauguration of the 9th International Congress in London in 1892, had displayed before us the historical development of human race. This is the sort of progress that you are talking about, Esther. An earlier Orientalist, the great French scholar Sylvestre de Sacre, had envisioned this process of display in a manner very similar to the World Exhibition. This is the desire, this is the European curiosity, this is the colonial knowledge. He had planned to establish a museum which was to be a vast depot of objects of all kinds, of drawings, of original books, maps, accounts of voyages, all ordered to those who wish to give themselves to the study of the Orient in such a way that each of these students would be able to feel himself transported as if by enchantment into the midst of, say, a Mongolian tribe or of the Chinese race, whichever he might have made the object of his study. I mean, what better description of anthropology than this one? Like, you'll just sit there and then they'll bring you the object. You don't even have to go there. And this is really how we understand knowledge today. Make it present to us. Like, you sit here in Richmond, Indiana, and accept to know the world as it is represented to you. To such an extent, we even have the goals to say, like, you are going to go and make a difference in the world. You're going to change the world. Who the hell are we? to change the world. Let's just start with Richmond if we can. But that empowerment, because you belong to a European tradition of producing knowledge and producing individuals, like go change the world. You are. So education, as you were saying, Hannah, is actually very much part of it. And we'll actually come to that, the way in which schools, prisons, societies, objects of knowledge are organized.
I had a follow-up comment earlier. I just didn't know if it was the appropriate time, but I was wondering if we could take what Derrida has said about education, even though it pertained mostly to philosophy, and maybe apply it to this type of problematic situation in the educational world.
Okay, how would you do that?
I don't know. That's what I'm preparing to think about. I think that's a good way to approach this, maybe. I don't know.
I think you already know. Maybe you just need to articulate.
I guess maybe like that thing that you said about uneducating ourselves first, maybe that would be like the first acknowledgement that we make, and then the process of asking questions and being prepared to like not necessarily be able to answer them at first, and not like having that mindset of, okay, so this question has a specific discipline that will be able to answer it. Like coming back to that philosophy of being open to spend more time thinking first before jumping to conclusions, and then somehow, I don't really know, I'm not sure.
I think that's a good way of starting, definitely. So we really look at education as a kind of product, a product that is going to empower us to exhibit some kind of domination on the world. Like that's really what we are doing. This is what we are expecting from you. That's what you are expecting from us. And you are saying like, I'm investing in this exhibition and coming here and trying to get a perspective. Give me a good perspective. Give me a perspective from which I can dominate, understand, and manage the world. Now, is there anything wrong with that? No. I mean, it's not necessarily I'm saying like, oh, it's terrible, never do that, etc. But unless it is accompanied by a kind of critical reflection on the very conditions in which you are being educated, then you are no different than any power discourse that separates itself from its object and establishes a domination over the object. And that's what European science allowed us to do. I mean, we are not part of the nature anymore. We live in a almost entirely artificially created environment with artificial lights and artificial computers, etc. And we don't even see ourselves as a part of nature in our everyday existence. Yet we are expected to confront something like climate change of a planet that we are supposed to be part of. Are we really part of it? I mean, that's a serious question. Are we really part of the planet in our everyday existence? Or in a very generalized fashion, like, oh, you are not going to be able to find water to drink in 200 years. Okay. How do I relate to that? Really? Dependent, you mean?
Definitely dependent on, but even like electricity and these sort of modernization that we created still rely on the process like coal and
Sure.
natural gas and these things that provide us with these objects. So I guess in a roundabout way, we're still connected and we still breathe the air, obviously, whatever.
Yeah, food, I'm not sure. I'm okay with air, but food is a little more complex. Like you can probably produce those. Now, of course, I mean, it's in a very sort of straightforward sense. Of course, we are connected. We must be connected, sure. But is our existence reflecting that? in a way that we still operate on an assumption like I'm not outside, that's nature, it's out there, it's something like there, as opposed to here, there is, then can I see the natural here, like this is the wood, and this is the silicon that was made by exploiting certain people in other parts of the world, etc. But our existence doesn't really reflect that. Our existence seems to be fairly distant, and I think that's the effect of this kind of understanding of the world. It's like a picture. I don't even experience myself as an organic being unless I'm sick and hungry or something. But for the most part, it's a purely representational being. How do I appear to others? Is my profile good? Am I like giving a good vibe, etc.? So these are all questions in which our ontological being is at stake, rather than just simply what other people did to other people, like colonization, etc. So, yeah, the world is an exhibition, and then he refers to, of course, Derrida and Heidegger in terms of how this object is created, how human beings created as a colonial object, as something to be known, something to be understood, and how it's objectified and put into a picture. So we are going to discuss in detail of these in chapter 1 and 2, but those are this what he calls the panoptic gaze, like that position of power from which that's Muhammad Ali's question with respect to Disney, like that position of I don't know, a control, like perspective, like I can rule this, I can contain this, I can bring this all together. I have orientation. And that's what you do, right? When you are educated, like first you sort of feel like, oh, I don't know what's going on, I'm so confused, I don't have a perspective. And then you distance yourself a little bit, you try to get a little bit higher and find that higher perspective and try to look at, oh, now I see this. Oh, I'm controlling all of these. They are all under my perspective.
Yeah, I feel like go back to this question. And I think like maybe for that is all like in order to I think maybe should be that like in order to even be erased, like the meaning people had to be made something that was first of all legible and then like and so like you have like
Population.
yeah like you like instead of like so it's like it's almost like a statement like these are like specific people and like, these are just populations and like that like so like land surveyors and that kind of thing and so like, first like we started possibly being like very very visible and then the action generated so I guess like what to do then would be because like yeah like on one hand like in like political terms like theory completed like history and like narration on the other hand like I guess the whole point not yeah like what like this perhaps in like even in like attempts sort of like mainstream it or still like offering this like offering these cultures, these people to like specific years. So like when you're like making like yeah, like it's like more representation and media and like making visible, I guess the question then should then be like visible to whom like who you're like representing yourself to. And maybe the task is actually to sort of undermine that like very dichotomy. Like, just be more visible with every very structured
Well, maybe it's not in terms of visibility that we should organize power and knowledge, yes. But I think that's a good discussion in terms of how do you eradicate an entire group of people. Like, how do you, first you need to identify it as such. First, you know, like, you can almost say, like, how do people die? Like, British colonialism killed, exterminated millions and millions of people. And all I say here is like millions of people. Who people? People. People. It's general. Like these, etc. And then, which I hope you noticed this weekend, Prince Philip dies. This guy is 99 years old. He is colonialism. I mean, he is like the epitome of colonial structure. He dies and everybody's like, oh, I'm so sorry. Prince, like everybody, like, you know, even like the Commonwealth countries, like established like press releases, like, oh, we are so sad. He was such a great gentleman and very kind of supporter of the Queen, etc. And I go like, this is like insane. This guy is recognized, like he's a prince. He was. And he's 99 years old, like 1920s, like they were like little British colonial. This is before the Berlin Conference. Like this guy is it. Like if we have anything left from colonial structure. And then everyone's like, oh, I'm so sad. He was such a gentleman. He is responsible for killing millions of people, but hey, he was a good-hearted boy. Yeah, I was climbing walls this weekend. And like from even the Prime Minister of New Zealand, for whom I had some respect because of COVID and etc. She's like, oh, Prince. Whatever.
Do you think there was any way to handle that situation without being like amicable, like pure leader or a nation?
Well, you could get up and say, oh, well, the last bastion, probably not last bastion, but last bastion of colonialism died. Yay! Maybe we have hope for the future. Like we don't, obviously, but that could have been like, if it was 60s, maybe the discourse would be different. Now everybody is so well disciplined to, there's not even a sort of rebellious Commonwealth, former Commonwealth. So like somebody could have said like, this guy was kind of toxic. British Crown is toxic, remnants of colonialism. And I don't even know why we don't, but why they preserve it as a kind of symbol even. It's really like a symbol. What kind of a symbol is that? Like British superiority, or oh, we had the world, we still have it, kind of. And I mean, it's archaic, but not because like opera and all that, like, you know, jazz about British, oh, they are racist. Oh my God. I mean, they are racist because they asked these questions to her rather than having killed millions of people in them. This is absurd. Yeah, that's my rant for colonialism this week. Okay, I'm tired and you are quiet. So, oh, that's actually wrong, right? Okay, so I was thinking that it was 3 o'clock, so we'll go another hour. There's a couple of things we need to do on Wednesday because I can't just jump up and down here and try to get you excited. So maybe you should sit a little bit further apart. You'll be more animated. Maybe you are you can't move very comfortably. So each person on Wednesday will come up 2 sections from chapters 1 and 2 that you have a question, a comment, an explanation on, and I will call on people. What is it that you want to discuss? What is it that you found interesting in the text? Which paragraph? Why? Can you explain it to me? Or do you have a question? 2, and write it down if you don't, I will, well, even if you do, especially if you do, I'm going to collect them. So choose the passage, write it down, cut and paste, of course, you have electronic thing, and then pose your question and bring it to class. And I'm gonna collect them. And if you don't do it, I'm gonna ask you to do it during class. So please do it at home and come to class, because I don't want to choose which parts of the text we'll discuss. I don't want to decide this. That's too much power. I can't deal with that. So I want you to see how certain parts of the text relate to the questions that we were posing. Of course, I'm going to try to steer the discussion in terms of this conceptual questions that we are asking, but you need to be responsible for your own interrogation and your own understanding. So 2 separate passages from chapters 1 and 2. So no new reading. Actually, is that a good idea? Did you have any problem finishing up to 62? Was it too much, too little? I mean, we are in a 7-week condensed period, so I don't want to spend too much time on reading. So please also read chapter 3 for Wednesday. That's up to page 94. An appearance of order. That's a little bit more detailed and a little bit less fireworky thing, but it's good. I like it. And then we'll read chapter 4 for, I guess, next week. So chapter 4 and 5. So we'll finish the entire book. So please read chapters 1, 2, 3, and questions from chapter 1 and 2. Before you go, any questions about the papers? Yes. Yes, you can ask that question. Well, again, in that position that is created. So the question is concerning the visibility and invisibility and how that relates to the question of power. Who is in the position of power? Who is subjected to power? So the claim, the argument following the Foucauldian insight that the one who is visible is subject to the power. Power is not something that is owned by a subject. It is a position that is created. And that position is the neutral position of the observer. So in an exhibit, you have a subject position. Therefore, Foucault uses the expression subject position, not the subject, because it is not a substantial thing. Power is not a substantial thing that a person can have. Like, I have this much power. Like, whatever power that I might have as a person, as a professor, is only a subject position, and I only exercise that power because I occupy the position of being a professor in a college. It doesn't come naturally with my DNA to have power over people. It is a position that I occupy. So that position is theoretically that empty position of center, the one who is observing everything. So the more I have a vision, and this is how we try to understand Western conception of scientific power too. The objects need to present themselves to us in a certain way such that we can create a knowledge about them. And that knowledge produces power. Like, I know what's going to happen, therefore I can control it, right? You know, I can measure things that it's going to rain today, then I can shoot something to the sky and like stop the rain or whatever I want to do. But this power relation is already related to power that comes from knowledge. But more importantly, in order to be able to produce knowledge, you need to exercise a certain power over nature that has to, as a result of that, present itself as object. So this is the control group in experiments, the kind of like getting to the nature and fitting it into certain structures so that it answers certain questions. So in order to produce knowledge, you need power. And that's the colonial structure. Namely, it's not just we learn through anthropology facts about human beings, therefore we can exterminate them now or something. It is because we could exterminate them that we produce knowledge about them. So this, the axis of knowledge and power, and the fact that it is invisible, that it is not me, it is that center, that kind of, and that center historically, of course, is mostly occupied by white European male subject. But the trick of it is that anybody can occupy that position because it's a structural power. Therefore, by turning myself into white male European subject, I'm not undoing that power structure. In fact, I'm reinforcing that. I'm reinforcing that model. And in fact, in history of colonialism, the power of the colonizer is actually carried equally by the formerly colonized. And we continue with this, what we call self-colonization, completely buying into the discourse that is created about me. And colonized believe that too, like, you know, most nations like, yes, yes, we are exactly that. We know ourselves as the object of knowledge that West produced about us. And we accept that. Like, you know, Turks are lazy, right? Sorry, that's what we are. And we did that like a lot to ourselves. Like, no, we need to be modernized. We need to be different. We need to become just like that. And that kind of what you understood about yourself is really not what you understood about yourself, but something that others understood about yourself, and then you took that onto yourself. And mostly that knowledge that is produced and continues to be produced in the world is that Western knowledge. That's like without question even, and without even raising a suspicion about it. Like you say, of course, like what are you talking about? Like what kind of are you like a cultural relativist? What is going on with you? You can't even raise that as a legitimate question of how knowledge is produced. It is taken for granted. What are you, an anti-vaccine person or something? What is wrong with you? So like people say that, and you hear that. I mean, I'm sure you hear that. I'm sure you read cool things online about how these types of knowledge that we allow ourselves to be produced give power over us. And more like not just sort of negative power of not being able to do what you want to do. That would be a power. Maybe it's not that, but only wanting to do what others demand you to do. And thinking that that's what you want to do because you don't even have a kind of alternative. And everybody is like, oh, no, it's fine. I live like this, not a problem, because I want to live. I want to survive. Everything is fine. And yes, on the other hand, unfortunately, I hate to say this, but it's true, colonization not just produced mayhem and death for certain parts of the world, but produced certain privileges for certain people too, who were considered to be in those colonies. So they sort of they actively wanted, for example, during the independence or the Turkey, why don't we become a colony of England and France? People actually like wanted that. I also wanted to recognize Philip as my prince. That's called mandate, right? So at least if I were a British mandate, then I would speak English as a native speaker. That would give a lot of power. I didn't have to take like TOEFL and things like that. Okay, well, I'm tired. That was a hard beginning of the week. So we'll come back on Wednesday with your questions. But if you have any questions about the papers, please let me know. They are due next Sunday evening. Okay? Thank you.